Natalie, welcome to the show.
Thanks so much for having me. It's good to be with you.
Well, one of the things that we do here at ROL is we really like to start with the backstory. We really want to understand a little bit about where you came from. So, if you could, why don't you tell us a little bit about the early days, and was money something that was talked about much in your household as you were growing up?
Yeah, I love starting at the beginning. That's great. Um, Money was talked about a little bit growing up. My dad was a business owner. He's an attorney, and he was always in private practice. He went to law school when I was young, like 4, 5, 6 years old. He worked during the day and then went to law school at night. My mom was primarily a stay-at-home mom, and we didn't talk about money a ton, but I observed sort of the ups and downs of his income in the amount of stress that my mom showed around money. Um, Less so with my dad, he was more even keeled, but I could see that the swings in income really impacted my mom. And so I think that it intensified a natural inclination in me to seek stability with finances. And so as I grew up and became an adult and pursued this profession for almost the last 20 years, I've had to sort of unlearn a little bit of that and figure out where does that stability inclination and sort of um, acceleration help me, and where can it hurt me. And so, how do I need to actively manage against those downsides of it? It also really drove my sister and I both to pursue careers where we could earn for ourselves. So that, and it was never really spoken that way, but I think it kind of had the natural, outcome of us really wanting to be able to provide for ourselves and not have to be kind of at the whim of somebody else's business, even though my dad provided well for our family and I had a comfortable upbringing. But just seeing that stress in my mom, I think really had the most impact on me.
So let's talk about your mom for a minute. Was she able to change her relationship to money over time? So you being an expert in money after more than 17 or 16 years here in the business, were you able to have conversations with her? Was she able to make some changes in terms of how she thinks about money over time?
That's a good question. I think that perhaps my mom and dad found the right amount of information for my mom to know about how the business was doing. And I don't mean hiding information from her, but I had a bad day or work was hard today, and there's the potential implication of, and that hurts our personal finances, whether or not that's true. And so I think, I don't know how much my mom has transformed her understanding of money, but I will say that I think my mom and dad figured out how to get to a good place between the two of them in terms of how information is shared and when information is shared and what information is shared about work for my dad.
And so you had some of these examples growing up, and I think you're married. I think you have kids. So how do you think about things that you learned maybe in a positive way
Mhm.
growing up? Things that you say, that's I want to model the opposite of what I learned. So how are you thinking about, like, with your kids and your relationships? How are you thinking about money based on what you've learned over all these years?
That's a great question, and a really big one. So I'll try to have a pointed answer. Um, I think for me, it's really important that we have an open dialogue about money in our household. So we don't talk about it all the time, but it's just a subject of, like, just like football or the Golden State Warriors and whether they're going to beat the Celtics in the NBA Finals. It's just something that we talk about. And because we talk about it regularly and part of normal life, it's not emotionally charged most of the time. So it can just sort of be neutral instead of having that, like, emotional infusing of either it's stressful or it's exciting or it just is. So I think that's been a helpful thing. Um, I think one of the things my parents did, which I really liked, was, I grew up with an older sister, and they started to give us a clothing allowance once in the fall and once in the spring. And I don't remember how much it was. I'm going to say $200. But it was up to us to spend that money. And that's what we needed to use for that 6-month period. And so it allowed us to not only just have like a weekly or a monthly allowance, but to have to budget an amount of money over needs that stretched a little bit longer. If I remember correctly, I think my sister would go out and spend it all at once. And I was more of like well, I don't need anything, so I'm not really going to spend it yet. So I think that was a positive thing that I like doing for my kids as well. We use Greenlight for my kids, which allows them to have money for spending and money for savings and money for different goals, and they can actually invest as well. And they have a simple app that they can look at their money on their iPads. And I like the idea of them understanding that they can move money from one thing to another, and they can manage balances, and just those simple skills of like, this is the money that you have. You get $4 or $5 a week as your allowance. My kids are like almost 8 and 10. So I like that they're practicing those things, and that money's out in the open.
Yeah, and it's interesting as you talk about kids. I've got 3 kids. They're quite a bit older than you and all out in the workforce right now. But it's interesting, and I'm in the financial business, obviously, how all 3 of them are pretty different in terms of how they think about money. And it's actually evolved over time. One of them, when she was growing up, was really more of a saver. And another one was very much into fashion and really wanted to spend money whenever the money came in. And now she's doing a pretty good job at being a saver. So it's interesting how even growing up in the same household, I can have 3 kids that all have somewhat differing views on money. So, we try our best and then put them out there and see what happens. So we certainly can't control what happens after we give them what we think is our best wisdom.
Yeah.
So, okay. So you take your first job or so in the working world, and you went to Ameriprise. So tell me about the experience at Ameriprise early in your career. What did you learn then that perhaps is still sticking with you today?
Yeah, so I started with Ameriprise in 2004, and I was in their P1 channel. So for those who are familiar or aren't familiar with Ameriprise, they have 2 channels. P1 is employee advisors and P2 is franchise advisors. So I started as an employee advisor. I went through about 6 months in that program. I did really I was on the top of the board in terms of sales. I was able to convince people to let this 22-year-old who looked 14 at the time help them with their financial decisions. But for me, I really wanted to make sure that I was being a good steward of that responsibility. And I felt really uncomfortable doing that when I didn't feel like I knew enough. And for multiple reasons that I won't get into, there were some HR issues in the office that I was in. I really was looking for mentorship and a healthier office environment. And so I actually transitioned over the P2 side about 6 months in. And I worked under a P2 advisor as an associate, Neil Littlejohn. And he was a phenomenal mentor. I worked for him for almost 7 years. I grew into kind of a junior partner with his firm. And we were helping people my parents' age, which was fine. I mean, that's who everybody helped, right? And that's kind of still who everybody helps. I've always had a passion for, I think this is not uncommon, serving my own demographic. So I was finding opportunities, teaching workshops, giving free advice, doing free planning for people in their 20s and 30s. And then I was serving people my parents' age for money. And it was around 2011, 2012 that my husband and I and a developer friend, we were like, how can we solve this problem, right? There's got to be a way to leverage technology to take some of the burden, because I was able to see firsthand what the amount of work that it takes to do really good financial planning for somebody. So how can we provide a lot of the benefit of that, leverage technology better than, it was leveraged. This was a decade ago, right? There's been a lot of change over that time period. And so in doing competitive research on what the opportunity was in that space, I found Learnvest. And so that's kind of how I transitioned over into the fintech space.
So I want to talk about Learnvest for a little bit here, because Learnvest, in my impression, is sort of the opposite of deep financial planning. And I think you just said here a minute ago about how you really began to realize just how much work there is to do really good financial planning. Yet you're at Learnvest, they charge a very low fee, and they try to do some semblance of financial planning. So tell me about that experience in terms of what you learned about financial planning, what you learned about the amount of information that you need to get from your clients there in order to provide them with maybe 90% of the value that was available. So tell me a little bit about that the trade-off there in what you were doing at Learnvest.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, it really ultimately transformed my thinking quite a bit, and has impacted the way I now have an RIA, so that I founded 2 years ago, and I still actually work in fintech as well. But it's really like transformed the way I think about how we deliver value to clients and what is valuable to clients, and where do we have impact. So moving to Learnvest, coming from Ameriprise, where we were still very much in like pleather binder, 125-page financial plan built in Fazware. I'm dating myself a little bit there. Moving from that over to fintech, and trying to deliver some semblance of financial planning. We were an RIA, and we had about 14,000 clients at Learnvest. So it was not, millions, but it was a sizable operation. And we had to figure out, how do you provide value in the absence of the luxury of time, because we didn't have the luxury of fees, and we didn't really have the luxury of data. So even as financial planners, it can be challenging to gather data when a client has paid a fairly sizable fee to work with us. But at Learnvest, the entry point was lower and it was digital. And so we had to figure out, how do you provide value to someone with the least amount of data, the least amount of time, and the least amount of money, right? The lowest price point, and still have an impact on them. And that really transformed my thinking from pleather binder and edit down what you're going to say to the client, to start with nothing. If I only had 30 minutes to talk to this person, or I only had half their data, or I only had, this subset of information. As a comprehensive financial planner, at first it was like, well, we can't provide value. I need to know all the things. I can't answer this question if I don't know these other 1,200 things about you, right? But we were kind of forced into this use case to consider of, but how much could you do? How much could you do with how little you could have? And I think that was really valuable, because what it transformed for me is thinking about impact weighted work. So if I can spend 30 minutes with you and have some data around where you are, is there somewhere that I can spot that would have a lot of impact for you? And maybe it's enrolling in your 401k and setting up that auto escalator to increase by 1% a year, and hopefully you won't notice it. And then we're not going to talk again, or maybe we talk 1 or 2 more times, but over the next 5 years, you're going to get to saving 15% or 10% or whatever in your 401k. So really thinking about, where can I have the most impact? And that's really, that's the starting with nothing sort of approach that I take in my practice as well. So my deliverables I built from scratch, started with nothing on the page. And it was like, what is the most powerful conversation that I can have with the client right now that gives them the information that they need and the context that they need, so that they can make great decisions for themselves in this moment? That's how I built my deliverables. And it was just a very different, I didn't start with output from a planning software and then figure out what I wanted to put in front of them. It was I have a blank sheet, what needs to be on there to help them the most.
Yeah, and I find that very fascinating, because having those kinds of constraints, you don't have a lot of revenue coming in, you can't spend a lot of time with them, you can't gather a lot of data. So having constraints forces you to be creative. And so you're starting with the blank slate. So I want to dig into, what did you find in your personal practice today, as well as at your time at Learnvest? What did you find were those key pieces of information that you did gather? If there were only 5 bits of information you could get, what are those 5 bits? I think you gave one example here of, maybe we put you in a 401k and we put a 1% escalator in there. So that might be one example. What are some other things in terms of the data that you discovered was just super relevant?
Yeah, I mean, in the Learnvest days, it would depend to some extent on what the client was going through. So Learnvest was primarily serving people that made, I would say, 50,000 to 125,000 in income. So they weren't generally super low income. They were almost all in their 20s and 30s. And so that's kind of just to give you a flavor of who we were helping. And some of our clients, the best thing that we could do is like help them really understand how detrimental credit card debt over time would be for them and what it would take to get out of it, and give them a really solid plan of how to do that reasonably. breaking the credit card debt cycle, which at Learnvest we defined as making extra payments that are really more than you can afford. And then by the week 3 or week 4 in your budget, you don't have enough cash left. And so then you have to charge your last week or two's of expenses on your credit card. And so you get in this cycle of like, I want to make big payments, but oh shoot, that was actually too big. And now I'm having to use my credit card again. So helping people learn, you know, for a client like that, the balance between slowly building an emergency fund and really truly breaking that credit card debt cycle by having a realistic budget so that you can figure out, I really can't make extra payments of $800 a month. They need to be $250, but I can stick to the $250 and I can put the card in the freezer, or I can cut it up, or I can not have to use it anymore. So it kind of depended on what the client was going through. We also got clients who had no debt, who had a lot of excess income on a monthly basis because their expenses were really small. And so for them, it was helping them understand how much to have in cash, and then how to think about their longer term goals and what investing over time could do for them. So you have to know a little bit about the person, but what we realized is it's pretty quick to figure out, you know, within 5 minutes of talking to you, I can figure out where are your primary pain points and where can I have the most impact for you long term. You might have come to me asking about, should I use an HSA? Or I want to know if I should do all international stock or 50-50, you know, US international, when really, I mean, that's a detail, right? That's not where I'm going to have the highest impact for you. And so I think being able to kind of click quickly and figure out where's your highest need and where can I have the most impact was really transformational at Learnvest.
Now, what about in your practice today? Give me a sense for the kinds of clients that you're working with, and are you doing comprehensive financial planning using eMoney, Money Guide Pro, one of those types of systems, or are you taking that same thinking and saying, let me just start with zero and then stack on top of that the things that I really need that are going to get me maybe 90% of the value in the most efficient use of time and money here?
Yeah, good question. So one of the primary things I did at Learnvest was build financial planning software from scratch. So I know what software looks like on the inside. I'm actually building financial planning software for consumers, direct to consumer at Monarch. So I have a lot of healthy respect for financial planning software. The clients I serve, I'm able to manipulate manipulate the numbers best in Excel. So I actually don't use planning software at this moment. I have pretty robust spreadsheets built that allow me to do what I need to do as efficiently as possible, because for me, efficiency keeps my prices more reasonable. And that's important to me. I want to feel affordable and accessible for the demographic that I'm working with. In terms of who I serve, you know, one of the big reasons that that works for me and may not work for many other advisors is that my clients are almost all in their 30s and early 40s. They typically have young families. I think 4 clients had babies last quarter, but their kids are generally between babies and elementary school. They're often dual income. They're often in tech. Almost all of my clients have substantial equity comp. They're like director, senior director, VP sort of level where they work. So they have a good clip of income, but they generally live in high cost places like New York, San Francisco, and then other places that are kind of coming up like North Carolina, Colorado, et cetera. And their cash flow is tight, even though they make good income, because they've got big mortgages, because they live in expensive places, and they've got high childcare costs that really will go down over time, but they're in that crunch period, many of them with a kid under 5. So that's who I help. In terms of where I can have the biggest impact, I think for them, it's helping them have the perspective of how to look at both the close-up view of like, how is money flowing every month, and then balancing that with some of the longer term stuff. And for my clients, figuring out where their equity comp fits in, how to handle it from a tax perspective and an investment perspective, sure, but what does that equity comp mean for your ability to accomplish your goals? And so, and we can talk about my process in more detail if you want, but I talk with clients with equity comp about like base hit and home run goals, right? So that's a lot of the value is figuring out. And for me, a base hit goal, and pardon the sports analogy, I grew up playing sports. I know I'm a woman in a male dominated industry, and I got an email from a wholesaler saying, you want to be part of our golf event? And I was like, no, me and most women still don't golf. Anyway, sorry. So we figure out which ones are base hit goals and which ones are home run goals. So base hit goal might be, let's make sure you can at least retire in your mid 60s. Home run goal might be, I want to retire by 45 and then work for another 5 years consulting, making a lot less than I make now, and then fully retire at 50. That might be a home run goal, right? So we're going to match the dollars that are, we're not going to take as much risk on the dollars that are to fund a base hit goal as we would potentially on the money that's for a home run goal. So if somebody has RSUs and they're not on track for their mid 60s retirement, we're probably selling those RSUs when they vest and diversifying out of them, right? If they're already on track for retirement and those RSUs are for a home run goal, they can make the decision about whether they want to take the risk. Do you want your company's stock performance to be the thing that gets you there or doesn't get you there? And for a lot of my clients, they're not going to get there unless they have a windfall. So it's up to them. Do you want to take the risk? Because that is likely the only way that you're going to reach that early retirement goal. However, it might not come to fruition and it could go to zero. So I think for my clients, that's where I have a lot of impact. I hope I addressed your question.
Yeah, and a couple other areas that I want to dig into here. We do have a question here from Jerry, and he's asking, what questions do you ask in the first 5 minutes to really determine what their pain points are? And I think in this next area that I want to go into, I think you'll be able to answer that. And for those of you that are listening or watching this live, please ask your questions and we'll definitely get to them. But I want to talk about your meeting process. So if you have like a typical 3 meetings with a new client, 4 meetings, and just kind of briefly walk me through that. And then I also know that you have a values toolkit. And so really trying to understand your client's values is a key part of the process. So just let us know when that comes into the process. I've got it here in front of me. We can pull that up on screen so everyone can see as you walk through that, because that's very much in keeping with what we teach here at ROL Advisors. So yeah, if you could just walk us through the meeting process with potential new clients.
Awesome. Yeah. So for potential new clients that come in, they schedule time directly from my website. Actually, right now we have a bit of a wait list for new clients, my fellow lead planner, Cindy and I. So they sign up for our wait list or they're introduced to us via email and we put them on our wait list. And when we're meeting with a potential new client, I talk very little and they talk a lot. We do a 45-minute meeting, and what I share in the beginning is this time is for us to figure out whether we're a good fit for you and whether you're a good fit for us. We want to make sure that if you decide to hire us, that we feel like our process and our approach is going to be a great fit to get you exactly where you want to go. And so we're going to be listening for those kinds of things. And we will share what the process looks like so that you can decide whether we're the right fit for you. I usually say, like, I'm happy to go through my bio and my background. If you've gone to my website and seen it, that's fine. If you have any questions there, I'm happy to answer them. And they usually say, no, we're good. You were referred by somebody we know or whatever. And then I say, you know, I would just like to know, like, what brought you to reaching out and connecting and wanting to start this process potentially right now. And I let them answer and see where they go. And I let the conversation unfold very organically. I take really detailed notes on my other monitor. I will quote the client in my notes. So if they say something really specific, the way they think about something, like, we look at our careers as trading off when one of us runs and one of us jogs, so that the one that's jogging can have a bigger role at home. And we kind of trade off between those two things. I will write that like word for word in my notes because I really want to like hear what matters to the client. So I will ask about like what goals they're working on, what challenges they have, what questions they have. I'll ask a little bit of financial information, nothing too specific, but I want to get a sense of, are they a good fit for us, you know, and what do things look like? And then I explain the process to them. We wrap up, I send them a follow-up email that summarizes what we said we would talk about and cover in our work together. So that's where I will like quote them back to themselves and say, you know, you wanted to figure out a way that you can trade off in your career so that one of you can jog and one of you can run, and the one that's jogging during that time period can have a larger role at home. So the one that's running can really focus on career. I will write that in there. That is a bullet. So it's not a bullet of like retirement analysis to figure out blah, 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 blah. These are not cut and paste bullets. They're bespoke every time. But that's what the potential client process looks like. About 88%, actually year to date, it's more like 92%. So I'm going to say around 90% of our clients or potential clients that we meet with hire us. I think part of that is because we are specific enough in our website and we're specific enough in the work that we do with clients that they're kind of like not pre-qualified from a financial standpoint, but a stage of life standpoint, what challenges they're facing. They kind of already get the deal of who we work with. And so I think that filtering really helps. The first client meeting, we do ask for pretty traditional data gathering before that first meeting. In that first meeting, or one of those pieces of data though, is that values exercise. So I don't know if you want to address that now or go through the meeting process and then talk about the values. Whatever works for you is great.
Well, let's go through it now. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen here. Yeah, and I think we got it pulled up here. Yeah, so if you want to walk us through this and just how it gets introduced and
Awesome.
the number of people that actually complete this thing.
Yeah, so I would say like 80 to 90% of our clients take us up on the offer to do the values exercise as part of that initial data gathering. I have them do it as homework, just as they're gathering all of their financial details for me. And in their financial data spreadsheet, we have a spot where they fill in their core values that they came up with through this process. So the guide itself, which we can give access to the listeners today, it talks through like in very clear, plain language, what are values? And I have several definitions here because usually like one really hits home for somebody. For me, like driving force and the anchor and the purpose for your life, those really hit home for me in terms of what are values. I talk about the two types of values. So there's what is most important, and that might be relationships, community, health, justice, generosity. And then there's sort of the like, I'm sorry, not generosity. And then there's sort of like how you live your life. So generosity, loyalty, integrity, curiosity, learning and growth, adventure. Those are more of how you're going about the days that you spend. The other ones might be more things that you pursue directly. So you can scroll to the next page. I talk about why values are important. And really here, like what I believe, and it sounds like it's relatively consistent with ROL, is that living a life in alignment with your values is amongst the most effective ways to find contentment and fulfillment and peace and clarity and purpose. And so for me, that's the reason that values are important. That's the reason I want to understand what my clients' values are, so that in the work that we do, it drives them towards that outcome. Because I care less about the year that they retire. I care more about the fact that they get to live a life that's more and more in alignment with the things that really matter to them. So if you want to pop to the next page, actually one more page. So in figuring out what their values are, I use a process which is on the next, stay on this page, but 50 words to start with, which is similar to like a Doug Lennox Think to Perform, Chuck Wachendorfer sort of card sort. But I find that these values prompters questions are really powerful for my clients because one of them or two of them really resonate. I think the ones that typically resonate the most are if I made a decision that required me to stretch out of my comfort zone or have less money, it would be worth it because of this value. I think that's a really clarifying, powerful question for people to contemplate. The other one that I find really hits home is like thinking about a favorite season of life. When you felt happy and content and really felt alive, and thinking about what was life-giving at that time. Where do you think that came from? So anyway, so I have them sort of consider those questions. And then if you want to pop to the last page here, I have some things for them to start with. I give them full freedom if they want to use sentences, if they want to combine them. If these aren't the words that speak to them, that's okay. But this is a good place to start and get the ball rolling. So that's the values exercise. Most of my clients do it before our first planning meeting. And we go over those in the first planning meeting. So the full agenda for the first planning meeting, the first thing we do is we go over those priorities that we worked on together in that potential client meeting. So all of those bespoke bullets that I wrote out of you want to, run and jog and all those things, we go over all of those and just kind of confirm and align that like, this is what we're going to accomplish together. It's kind of like our statement of work together. we then go through their core values, and I ask them two questions. One of them is, when you think about how your life looks right now, so not your finances, not necessarily just your finances, but your life in general, how do you feel about the level of alignment as you look at these core values? And a lot of really great stuff comes up there. And then I ask, what do you think that you could do as you reflect to be more aligned? Are there tangible things that we could work on together? And I've had some really powerful things come out of that conversation. I have a client who is a stay-at-home doctor with little kiddos. Her husband works, and she's passionate about her career. Meaningful work is important to her. But in this season of life of having young kids, some of her values were balance and harmony, relationships, health. And so for her, taking time off from her career, even though she could earn quite a bit, is in alignment with her values. And so for me to know that is really important, because I'm not going to ask her, okay, when are you going back to work, so that we can figure out what to do with the money. It's like, I want to understand what works for you. Are you thinking when your little one is 5 that you might want to go back part-time or full-time? What does that look like for you? We've had the conversation of, you can have one more year at home with your kids now, or you can retire a year earlier in your 60s. So we've done the numbers to give that trade-off. Which one feels more valuable to you? And she was like, oh, hands down, another year now. I was like, great. So don't worry about working until at least 2023. And you'll retire at 62 instead of 61. She's like, yeah, that's great. So it's nice to be able to know what their values are so that we can use that in the planning process. I have another client who was working for a company that did really good work in the world. She was a VP, and she said, and meaningful work was a value. And she said, I don't feel like my work is meaningful. I said, that's interesting to hear, because the company you work for does really great work in the world. Tell me more about that. Is that because you've risen to the level of VP, and so you're finding that your days are filled with clearing obstacles and headcount and fighting for resources and all that kind of stuff, and that you're too disconnected from the end user? Or, is it the people around you? What is it? And she's like, I honestly think I need to go back and work in nonprofit. And so a lot of her plan was focused around, how do we help her by 6 months from then make half as much money for the rest of her career? She's in her 30s, right? Because that was what she needed to do to align with her values. So it informs the tangible financial planning work quite deeply.
So
Yeah.
if I could just interrupt for a second here. Going through an exercise like this, a values clarification exercise, is fantastic. I'm certainly 100% on board. I've been doing this for a long time as well. I'm curious about your development of this in terms of your stage of life. At what point in your career did you say to yourself, I think I need to create a values clarification exercise, because that, I think, could add real value to my clients? So where in your stage of development did that come into play, and how did it come about?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I was at Ameriprise at the same time that Doug Lennox was still at Ameriprise. And so they, he and Chuck then have the Think to Perform business and the behavioral financial advisor designation. I actually set us up to all get the behavioral financial advisor designation at Learnvest for all of our 40 plus CFPs there. So I've known about this type of stuff from Doug for, close to 15 years, because I was teaching workshops on this when I first got married. So I'm going to say 15 years. So the vast majority of my career. I think my understanding of how values work really changes perspective has grown over time, and how I can create an exercise and a planning process that integrates values is kind of ever evolving. My husband and I in our own personal lives have made very big career and financial decisions based on our core values. My husband took a job in December after being with the company 9 years. And on February 1st, he quit. So he was there for about 6 weeks. But it was very clear very quickly that being there was not in alignment. And so he just up and quit. And I felt totally great about that decision, and he felt great about it too, because it wasn't in alignment with values, and we had set ourselves up to be able to prioritize values-based decisions. So I think the levels, the layers of values-based decision-making continue to like reveal themselves to me in my own life and what I see in the lives of my clients.
Yeah, I totally agree. The whole idea of values evolves. I mean, for me, I think about what my values were, say, 20 years ago when the kids were younger and what
Mhm.
they are today as an empty nester. I mean, it changes over time. And so it's something that we have to keep fresh. You mentioned Doug Lennox, super guy. I met him back in the late 1990s and did a podcast with him on Between Now and Success a few years ago. So if anyone listening wants to get more information about Doug and just the real wisdom that comes from him, you can listen to that episode. So, okay, so we've got this first meeting. How does
Yes.
the first meeting end? And then what do we do in the second meeting?
Yeah. So first meeting, we do priorities, we do core values, net worth and cash flow, fairly typical financial plannery stuff. Cash flow, I'm a big fan of the fixed flex non-monthly sort of approach. And then we talk about goals. So by then I will have a sense of the goals that they shared with me at their very first potential client meeting. Excuse me. And so I will calculate how on track they are for all of those. What they're currently on track, if they keep doing what they're doing, what they're currently on track to retire, when they're currently on track to retire. So I have preliminary calculations to give some context, because what I've learned over the years is that if you just say to somebody, when would you like to retire? We can plan on anything. They say, we could all say it in harmony, right? Tomorrow would be good. So I like to have some numbers in front of them to give some context of what might be possible and what might not. So the way I handle the goals conversation is I first define funds available for goals. So this is kind of that perspective piece that I think is really impactful for clients. The funds available for goals are after they've paid their expenses. Is there an amount monthly that's available? Are there bonuses that are available? Are there RSUs or ESPP dollars on an ongoing basis that are available? So those are from more like cash flow over time. And then there's the amounts from assets, right? So 401ks are going to be for retirement. We're not going to unpin those. There's no decision to make. Same with 529s, Roth IRAs, all those things. But if they have a non-qualified brokerage account, or they have, for my clients, equity comp, so stock options, whether they're ISOs or NSOs, or stock that they have from previous companies, what goals are we going to allocate those towards, right? So those are kind of like funds that are available for goals that they need to make an active decision on. So I get them in the mindset of thinking about their money that way, of like, these are the unpinned dollars that we have opportunity to make decisions around. And then we go through the preliminary calculations for each of their goals. I have it all in a one-page table. So it's like goal, what you need to do to be on target, whether it's monthly or annual or one time to fund that goal, the time frame for the goal, what they're currently on track for, and then we prioritize. And so in that conversation, we develop those goals. So like as Carl Richards and Michael Kitzes would say, goal clarification, comma, over time, that idea that we're going to figure out what your goals are today, and they will probably evolve over time, but let's pick the best thing that we can shoot for the time being. And so we develop kind of the parameters of those goals. You're on track to retire at 73. Does that feel good? Do you want to keep going for that? I would recommend, I always say goals are a team sport, right? So I would recommend that we aim for something at least in your mid 60s if we can as a starting point, because we don't always get to choose when we want to retire. So anyway, so we develop those goals over together. Second meeting, I try to solve and map those funds that are available to goals to the goals and say, this is how far we can get based on your priorities. We go through each goal in detail, the assumptions behind them, etc. For a lot of my clients, the third meeting is focused on equity comp. So here's the equity comp you have, here's how it works, here's what it means, here are the tax ramifications, here are the decision points to consider. Given that we know what those dollars are for, because we went through that goals, funds available thing, we know that those equity comp dollars are for a home run goal, right? Cabin in the woods. If it happens, great. If it doesn't, who cares? So if you want to choose to take the risk on those dollars, here's the set of decisions to consider around those ISOs, for example. And then the fourth meeting, we go over investments, so 401ks, IRAs, etc. I make investment recommendations. We do insurance and estate planning, and then we do an action list that we try to get to one page. So that's the kind of like 4-meeting process that gets somebody to the end of the like initial planning. And then from there, it's quarterly meetings. We have specific things we cover each quarter.
Okay. And then how do you keep the values conversation alive over time, or do you?
Good question. So we talk about it at that first meeting. We also talk about it at the fourth meeting, because each meeting that I do, I'm basically building a quarter of their financial plan and delivering it to them. I send a PDF 24 to 48 hours before their meeting, and we look at it together. It's very visual. There's not a lot of I try to use as few words as possible. Um, and so by that fourth meeting, they're seeing all of it together, and we're talking through how the values connect to what those action, at the very end, it's like values at the top and actions at the bottom. And we kind of make that connection of how these actions connect to those values that you decided were important. And then on an annual basis, in our Q1 plan refresh, we put their core values in front of them again and say, do these still feel like they fit? And most of the time they do. Core values tend to be, I have found, more stable over time, at least for like seasons of life, than goals. Goals sometimes change a little more wildly than values, I have found. But we go over them, we say, gut check, do these still feel like the things that are most important to you? I ask the same two questions when you reflect on the last year. Where do you see alignment and where do you see potential misalignment? And as we look at the coming year, because this is our Q1 meeting, do you see opportunities that we can drive more alignment for you? And so we talk about those, and then we use those that year to help inform the ultimate action steps that we get to.
We have a question here from Fabian, and he's asking, what is the time frame between the meetings? So if we're talking about the onboarding process, from having that prospect meeting to you having that third or fourth meeting with them, roughly how long might that typically take?
Yeah, so the potential client meeting, sometimes people hire us in that meeting. I never require somebody to make a decision right then. This is going to make anybody who's like trained in sales, I don't know, pass out. But we send the follow-up email. We say, take the time that you need to talk together and decide whether you'd like to move forward. And we'll be here. If any questions come up, email us. And if you'd like to move forward, email us and we'll get the next step started. 90% of the time, they email us and say, let's get the next step started. Some people, that's a couple days, and some people, it's like 6 weeks. So if I haven't heard from them in a week or two, we have a standard follow-up, just checking in, wanted to know if you've made a decision. Oftentimes we have one more July spot available. We are happy to reserve it for you, but let us know if you would like us to. That is not a sales tactic. It's just like legitimately true that like we said we would have a July spot, where we only have one more left. If you want it, let us know. If not, if you need more time to decide, it may be a starting point in August or September, because that's true. It's not a tactic. And then if we haven't heard a couple weeks after that, we'll just do one more check-in. And then then it is what it is. So that tends to work really well for us. So that's the cadence of between the potential client meeting and starting together. And then once they say yes, it's usually about 3 weeks before their first meeting gets on the calendar, unless, which is the case now, that we're on a waiting list. And so we only have so many slots available. So right now we're filling, I think, August slots, and they know that up front. So we'll say, we will send you the homework right away. We will need it back by this date, and then we can hit the ground running in August. And then the first 4 planning meetings, those typically tend to be 3 to 4 weeks apart. Sometimes we have clients who have timely decisions they need to make about equity comp before the next raise, before the fair market value gets adjusted or something, or a home purchase decision. And so we will do those sometimes a week or 2 weeks apart, but typically they tend to be 3 to 4 weeks apart.
Okay. And I think I heard you say that roughly 90% of the people who have that first meeting with you, the prospect meeting, so to speak, end up becoming clients. Is that what you said?
Yes.
Okay. And some people listening might think, oh my gosh, that is an incredibly high percentage. And I suspect, correct me if I'm wrong, I suspect it's because you're very clear on who you are, the value that you provide, who is ideal to work with you, because you can add the most value to them. So I'm suspecting that your website and just how you communicate is going to attract people who are looking for exactly what you offer. Would that be fair to say?
I think that is fair to say. We are definitely, like, on our financial planning page of our website, it says we our sweet spot is working with people in their 30s and early 40s who have young families and are dealing with all of these things. So we don't talk about our bio pages, right? For Cindy and I, like, yes, that our bio pages are about us. And my homepage of my website, because I'm also a professional speaker, is kind of like professional speaking related. But the financial planning page, which is really where people go if they want to learn about me as a financial planner and want to consider working with our team, we talk about ourselves not at all. It's all about the client. Like, here's who we help and here's how we help them. They don't need to hear anything about me at that moment, right? And so I think that helps as well, that it allows them to self-identify. And instead of saying, I feel like I have a sense of who she is from the website, they say, I have a sense of who I am and she nailed me, right? I think that's more powerful. And so I think that's part of it. No one can go to my financial planning side page and get 4 sentences in and say, oh, I'm 70 and retired. She seems like a great fit for me, right? That's not going to happen, because we're just very clear about who we serve so that they can self-identify.
I want to switch gears here slightly. So you've done detailed financial planning at Ameriprise and in your practice today.
Yes.
You've done not detailed financial planning at Learnvest, and I suspect at Monarch Money, where you're also doing some work that's not necessarily detailed financial planning, trying to use technology. In your experience and in your opinion, how far can technology go to provide financial planning, and where's that limit in terms of technology can only take us this far to automate the financial planning process, to enhance the financial planning process, but ultimately you need human beings, human financial advisors to get us through that last mile, so to speak. How do you think about where one ends and the other one begins?
Great question. So you're right on that at Ameriprise and in my private practice, detailed financial planning. At Learnvest, it was a lighter version. It was still pretty decent financial planning, but it was a lighter version. At Monarch, we're trying to build actually very robust financial planning software for consumers. So that'll come to fruition, and we'll see how we label it later. But in terms of what I think technology can do and what I think human financial advisors can do, to be quite frank, I think if you're an advisor going to market and saying, here's what I can do for you, I can put together a portfolio of 10 ETFs and I can rebalance them over time. And if it's non-qualified, I'll harvest them for tax losses and we'll glide them towards a 50-50 by the time you're 65. If that is the entirety of your value proposition, I think technology can do a pretty good job of that. And so I think technology does a good job of saving advisors time, right? Because there are things we can leverage to make us more efficient. I think technology is starting to do some really cool assessments. And it sounds like you guys have that storyboard sort of digital experience. I think that I'm really loving seeing some of the behavioral things that technology is trying to solve. But I think we need to take the technology. I think there's opportunity to take the technology beyond better investing decisions. I think that we can move towards things like technology helping to track better, to help people understand incremental progress versus, well, you're not on track and too bad. Your number is 30. So I think there's a lot of things that technology can solve. I think in terms of what technology can't solve, are the things that I'm really excited about, that I think are most rewarding about the work that we do as advisors anyway. And I think this is probably very much in alignment with what you do as well. Technology is not going to facilitate a conversation between two partners that see things fundamentally differently, right? If you have an ENFP and an ESTJ, like my husband and I, an Enneagram 1 and an Enneagram 7, right? We see things very differently. I am like, let's get from point A to point B, and he is like a bumblebee buzzing through life, right? Like, ooh, squirrel. So we really benefit from having somebody else broker some of those conversations. And I have seen that in my own work. I think on the qualitative side, not the quantitative side, I think there's no technology that will replace the feeling of understanding that comes with talking to a human that understands the stage of life that you're in, that understands what it's like to be, a young, successful woman in tech who wants to have babies and is scared that it's going to totally upend her career. That is stuff that like no calculations are going to help her through. Sure, she can see, well, what does it look like if I work part-time, or what does it look like for childcare costs? But she needs a human to talk through that with. So I don't worry about technology replacing advisors. I think that there's a lot of opportunity for us to leverage technology even more to be able to focus on the work that I think is most meaningful, which is the relational part of it and the life planner part of it, to really help people understand themselves better as well, and to help improve their decision making.
So you mentioned that example about a woman who is trying to decide, about family versus work, and you've got your values exercise. How do you think about financial planning versus financial therapy versus applied behavioral finance? I mean, we're starting to see a lot more of I'm going to call it the therapy side. Now, we're not turning financial advisors into therapists, but there are people who are really trying to create the bridge between financial planning and the therapy world. How do you think about that? Do you envision moving yourself more toward that area over time, or the industry moving more toward that over time? How do you think about that?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think the industry is slowly moving towards that, which I think is phenomenal. I don't think that I'm ever going to go back to school and become a financial therapist. And I'm also very aware of the times when a client needs to talk to a therapist, and recognizing that I'm not a therapist. So I think it's important for us to understand our own boundaries of where we can really help and where we might need to say. I think that talking to someone about childhood trauma, for example, I think this is a bigger issue than what I, as a financial planner, can help you with. I think those are important boundaries to know, so that we don't all just like read an article and then it's like, okay, well, we're just as good as the therapist, so we're going to take that role, right? But I'm very excited about, I talked to the guys over at BFA, Behavioral Financial Advisor, at Think to Perform, and I was encouraging them to expand the use cases and expand the application of the fundamental principles that they use in that coursework, because they primarily focus on investment decisions. And to me, that work of alignment, about values, about what really matters, there's so much more broad implications and application for that work than just making better investment decisions. So I would love to see more movement in this direction. And I think ultimately it's really going to benefit the general public. So that makes me excited.
Good. All right. Well, we just have a few minutes left here. So again, if any of you listening to this live have any questions, just pop them in the box there and we'll get to those. And as we wait and see if there's any questions that come up, Natalie, what haven't I asked you that you wish I would have asked you?
What haven't you asked me? Oh, that's a good question. Well, one of the things that you mentioned in our first conversation was about letting clients be the hero in their story. And I don't know if that's something that you want to cover or not, but that might be something.
Yeah. Tell us about that.
Yeah. So for me and my approach to financial planning, I think it's transformed over the 2004 to 18 years that I've done this. And I was 23 and now I'm in my mid 40s. But I think I'm very clear that I am a thought partner and maybe a coach, maybe a mentor to my clients. I am not their parent. I am not their manager. I am not the knower and they are not the learner. It is their life and their plan that we are trying to work on together. I am there to be a support to them in them living their life. I would rather lay out information to them in a way that allows the answer to jump out of the page to them of like, oh, I definitely shouldn't pay off that. I hate my auto loan, but like, I definitely shouldn't pay it off because I can see that like, this is how much progress I can make over here. And then instead of me taking the credit for it, I get to say like, great decision, right? Like you did a great job. So I'm way more focused on helping the client feel like they're awesome instead of the client feeling like I'm awesome. Because I think, as we know about like, when we think about our relationships, right? If someone helps you feel awesome when you're with them, then they're going to think you're awesome too, right? So like, I would rather just focus on helping them feel efficacious, and that they have ownership, and that I would rather the right answer come out of their mouth than my mouth. And it took a long time for me to get there from a humility standpoint, to be honest, to not want to be the one that says the right answer in class, right? To like just keep my hand down and let them raise theirs. And then me say, I think that sounds like a great idea. Yes, I'm totally supportive, instead of me coming up with it, right? Because that also then helps them take ownership over it and actually implement. I don't have a lot of implementation issues with my clients. And I think a lot of it is because of this stance of they are the hero and I'm not.
Yeah, it sounds a bit like you're taking the role of a coach, because a coach, as distinguished from a consultant, is more about helping guide the client to realize the wisdom that's within them, or realizing what they want to do is within them, as opposed to the coach trying to tell them what to do. So would that be accurate to say as well, that you're really trying to help them come to their own decision, as opposed to you being the expert, like, oh, do this, this, and this?
Yes, absolutely. And I think it took getting over my own pride. And I think it took getting over the fear that if I did too good of a job of that they would leave me. Because if I taught them to fish well enough, why would they need me anymore? And I just had to get over that and say that would be a beautiful outcome. And I trust that more clients would be there for me to serve. And so I think those two things are really pivotal in allowing me to shift my thinking in that way.
Yeah, well, Natalie, I think that is a great way to wrap up the conversation today. So I appreciate that. If folks want to further connect with you, what's the best way for people to reach out to you?
LinkedIn is the best place to connect. I always, I don't post 12 times a day, so you don't have to worry that I'm going to spam your feed, but I do share what I'm up to and my thoughts and stuff there. So that's a great spot. I also do teach workshops on my deliverables and my planning process. So going in depth and sharing, actually I've created 5 different versions of my deliverables from a design standpoint. And so I share all of those templates and go through how to use them and how to maximize them and work with clients. So you can ping me on LinkedIn about that, or you can email me at workshops@natalietaylor.com to get on my wait list for the next one.
Excellent. All right. Well, thank you, Natalie.